Okay, good morning, everyone. Your Honour, you actually should remember Your Honour and try and use it tomorrow when we go ashore in Tahiti, because the locals will really appreciate the effort that you put in and try and speak some of their lingo, and in Bora Bora as well. So today I'm going to speak to you about the European discovery of Tahiti. And ladies, there's a lot of ladies here that are doing a circumnavigation of the world, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of your predecessors, the first woman to circumnavigate the world. And I'm also going to talk about the man that's considered to be the greatest traitor to mankind in history. So forget about Judas, forget about Benedict Arnold, this guy trumps them all, and that's not a hint either, by the way. So the first person to may have seen Tahiti was our friend Juan Fernandez. Now, a few months ago, we were back in the Juan Fernandez Island. Well, it seems like a few months ago, we were back in the Juan Fernandez Islands at Robinson Crusoe Island. So he was a Spanish explorer. He was frustrated by the fact that the Humboldt current, the current that we spoke about the last couple of talks, which goes up the coast of South America and then across the Pacific, he was frustrated trying to get going south against that current in a sailing ship back in those days without engines. So he actually went further out to sea and then turned south, and that's how he discovered the Juan Fernandez Islands, which are named in his honour. In 1576, he was commissioned by the Viceroy of Peru to do an exploration of the Pacific. And he went off for about 15 months, and he came back and he said he found this fantastic place. It was a mountainous, fertile place with strong flowing rivers, inhabited by white peoples, and with all the fruits necessary to live. And early historians thought this might have been New Zealand. But we now believe that because of the timeline, the limited timeline that he wouldn't have had time to get all the way to New Zealand and back again. So now the conventional thinking is that perhaps this was Tahiti or one of the islands of the French Polynesia. The person we know did see Tahiti but didn't land was a man by the name of Pedro de Queiroz. He was Portuguese, but he was actually sailing on behalf of the Spanish crown. And he'd been to the Pacific before and actually got credit for taking over an expedition where the leader had died, and he was able to get that expedition back to Spain, even though there was hardly any men alive after when they reached Spain because of illness that had happened during the voyage. He ended up being commissioned by King Philip of the Third of Spain and by also the Pope to go and search for Terra Australis, the Great South Land. And he left Callao in Peru in December 1605 with 3 ships to search for the Great South Land. At the time, the thinking was that there must be a huge continent to the south to offset the weight of Europe for the world, in case the world would tip over. They didn't know anything about Antarctica, a much even bigger continent at the time. So they thought there must be something out there. And he was assigned to go and look for it. So he sighted Tahiti on the February the 10th, 1606, and named it Sagittaria. We know this by the coordinates that he gave in his logs. And then he went on and he discovered what we now know as Vanuatu. Now, he thought he'd hit the jackpot. He thought this was the Great South Land, Terra Australis. So he named it Australia. It was actually the first place to be named Australia well before Australia. He named it Australia Spiritu Santo, the great southern land of the Holy Spirit, only to be able to circumnavigate this small island of Vanuatu in a few hours and have a bit of egg on his face with his crew. Now, I don't know whether he was embarrassed, but from my sense of humour and from my naval experience, I know that the crew might have had a bit of fun with him, along the lines of, we'll skip it, maybe that rock over there is Terra Australis, or I actually had a bigger Terra Australis for breakfast this morning, so along those lines. He might have been embarrassed because a few days later, the ships got separated. And instead of hanging around and looking for his other ships, as a good commander would do, he just turned around and followed his way back to Spain. He followed the route he'd already taken back to Spain. His second in command, or captain of one of the other ships, searched for him for a couple of weeks and couldn't find him. So he assumed that de Queiroz had been lost at sea. So he set sail going the other way, heading west. He wanted to get to Batavia to make repairs to his ships, and his name was Torres. And he was the first man to go through what we now know as the Torres Strait between Australia and New Guinea to reach Batavia. We've learnt about Jacob Rogerson when we were in Easter Island a couple of weeks ago. He was a Dutch explorer who was working for the Dutch West India Company, who were the great rivals of the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. And I'll do a talk about the VOC later on in the cruise. But he was also on an expedition to find the Terra Australis, the Great South Land. And he was the person who actually came across what we now know as Easter Island on April the 5th, 1722, which was Easter Sunday, and that's how Easter Island became to get his name. He went on and then discovered Bora Bora, and then Samoa. When he eventually reached Batavia, which we now know as Jakarta in Indonesia, he was arrested by the VOC for violating their monopoly. They believed that they had a monopoly on all trade, on all exploration through half the world, as we'll talk about at a later date. So he was arrested, thrown into prison. Eventually he made his way back to the Netherlands, where through some court cases he and his crew received compensation for the losses that they had during their voyage. The first person that we know actually came to Tahiti and landed was a man by the name of Samuel Wallace. He was in command of HMS Dolphin. Now, it was a part of a two-ship fleet that was supposed to be sailing or circumnavigating the world, the other ship being HMS Swallow under the command of Captain Philip Carteret. Now, HMS Dolphin itself had a fairly interesting history, and I really enjoyed this history. It was launched in 1751, and it had fought in the 7 Years' War, which was known in the Americas more commonly as the French-Indian War. And it was one of the first global wars. There was battles fought in North America and South America, of course in Europe. It was a war between the French and the British over what was known then as New France, or what we know now as Canada. But battles were fought all over the world. There were sea battles fought in the Atlantic and the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. So it was a fairly global war. But the Dolphin was involved in the Battle of Minorca, which I don't think any of you would have heard of. It's not a very famous battle at all. The only reason it's famous is because it led to the execution of the most senior British officer in history, and his name was Admiral John Byng. Now, he had been ordered by the Admiralty to go to Gibraltar, take command of the fleet there, and then sail to the island of Minorca and relieve the garrison there that was being attacked by the French. So he went off to Gibraltar and he saw the fleet, and he was immediately very, very disappointed. The fleet was in terrible condition. Most of the crews had deserted and gone ashore. The ships weren't fit to sail, really. But he had his orders, so he sent press gangs ashore to try and get more people to man these ships, even though most of these people weren't experienced seamen and had no experience at naval warfare at all. But he was able to get enough people together to actually sail the ships. And they went off to Minorca. He tried to make contact with the garrison there, but he didn't get a response from the garrison, so he didn't really know what was going on. And then the very next day, the French fleet arrived, and the Battle of Minorca took place. It wasn't much of a battle at all. There was a few broadsides from ships. There was no casualties. There was no ships lost at sea or anything. And both sides decided to withdraw. And Byng had a meeting with his senior commanders, all these captains of his ships, and there was a universal decision made that the best course of action would be return to Gibraltar, try and repair the ships, give the men more training before returning. But when Byng got back to Gibraltar, he was summoned immediately back to London by the Admiralty. And when he arrived there, he was arrested and put on court-martial for the charge of not doing his utmost against the enemy. Now, this was a very, very serious charge. It was a capital crime. And it had come about a couple of years earlier when a young lieutenant had been forced to take command of a British ship during a battle with the French, when his captain and all of the senior officers on board the ship had been killed. The lieutenant had very little experience himself. He saw that a lot of the guns on board the ship were now out of action. A lot of people were dead. He didn't think he had enough resources to continue the battle. So he surrendered his ship to the French, and he was captured. He was later exchanged for French captives, and when he went back to England, he was arrested and he was court-martialed for the loss of this ship, and he was charged with not doing his utmost against the enemy. Now, he eventually was executed, and there was an outcry in England. I mean, the public were incensed by this, the press were incensed, and even the Parliament were incensed by it. It was believed that if he'd been a much more, or even a more senior officer, or had come from a more well-to-do family or a more influential family, this would never have happened. And so the Parliament changed the Articles of War to say that anyone, no matter what their status or rank or anything else, if they didn't do their utmost against the enemy, it was a capital crime and they would be executed. So the court-martial of Byng had no discretion whatsoever. They had to find him guilty and they had to order his execution. But the entire court-martial panel recommended clemency. The only person that could give clemency was King George, and he wasn't inclined to. He was in conflict at the time with the Prime Minister, who was William the Pitt the Elder, and all of Parliament about the status of the monarchy, how much power the monarchy had as opposed to the Parliament. So the king wasn't happy with Parliament and didn't want to do anything that they wanted him to do. So he denied clemency. And poor old Admiral Byng was the victim. He was taken out to his ship, and the rest of the fleet was assembled around the ship. He was taken out to the quarterdeck. He was told to kneel on a pillow, and then he was executed by a party of Marines after he dropped his handkerchief to indicate that he was ready to be executed. So he was the most senior British officer ever to be executed. Back to the Dolphin, though. So the Dolphin also had completed the fastest circumnavigation of the world at that time. It had set off in June 1764 under the command of Commodore John Byron, a fairly famous name in itself. He was the officer who had claimed the Falklands for England, for Britain. And he was also the uncle of Lord Byron, the famous poet. But Dolphin arrived in Tahiti. He learnt from the natives that it was called Tahiti, but he decided he would change the name to King George III Island. He had arrived there on June the 18th, 1767. So King George III Island, I mean, this guy was a bit sucking up, wasn't it? I mean, he was obviously after a promotion or a knighthood or something. And as it turns out, he did become a commissioner of the Admiralty later in life, so he did all right for himself. He wasn't actually the first person to go ashore, though. He was ill when they arrived in Tahiti, so he sent his other senior officer, Tobias Ferno, ashore. Now, Ferno himself became famous later when he was the commander of HMS Adventure during Captain Cooke's second expedition to the Pacific, and the Ferno group of islands between the mainland of Australia and Tasmania is named in his honour. And for those of us who are going on after Sydney, we'll be cruising past those islands as on the way to Tasmania. When Dolphin arrived in Tahiti, they received a fairly hostile reception. The local natives rowed out in canoes and flung stones using slings to throw rocks and stones at the ship. But the British retaliated by firing upon these canoes and also firing their cannons at the shore. And it was only a few minutes later that the Tahitians realised that they were badly outgunned and that they started offering peace offerings. When Wallace recovered enough, he went ashore and he met the Queen, a lady by the name of OBerry. She was the local chieftain of the tribes there. Now, the men went ashore and they were absolutely amazed with the friendly reception that they received, especially from the local women, who were very, very friendly, if you know what I mean. Now, these Tahitians had never seen anything like iron before. I mean, this was foreign to them. They couldn't believe this material, how good it was for axes and knives and things. And the local ladies started swapping their sexual favours for things as small as an iron nail. And soon Wallace realised that they had to leave Tahiti after 6 weeks because all the nails from the ship were being taken out and taken ashore. and the ship was in danger of falling apart. So they left. He returned to England in May 1768, which was great because it was in time to inform Captain Cooke of what, and give him information about the South Pacific and about Tahiti before he set sail on his very first voyage of discovery to the Pacific. So that was very handy for Cooke. Now, the next person to visit Tahiti was the famous, or the great French explorer Bougainville. He was on the very first French circumnavigation of the world. He had been born in Paris in 1729 and joined the army as a musketeer. He also fought in the 7 Years' War, but this time on the side of the French, and had a very, very distinctive career. He fought in the battles in Canada, at Fort Oswego, Fort William Henry, and he was wounded during the battle at Fort Carillon. He was wounded so seriously that he had to return to France. But before he left, his commander said to him, "We need more resources. You have to implore the government back in France and the military commanders back there to give us more. We need more men. We need more munitions. We need more horses. We need more of everything." But when he got there, France was in a bit of turmoil as well. There was rebellion in the air. Things weren't going well with the war. They feared an invasion from England as well. So he was told, when the house is on fire, one does not worry about the stables. In other words, with France in a desperate situation itself, we weren't going to worry too much about what was happening in Canada. He returned back to New France, Canada, and fought in the Battle of Quebec, but was captured during that battle when Quebec fell. And he was eventually exchanged in a prisoner exchange on the proviso that he would not take any further part in the war, which was an honourable thing. It was just a matter of honour to do that. But he didn't. But he did have a very big part in the negotiations for the peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris, which brought the 7 Years' War to an end. After the war, he joined the Navy, and he sailed to the Falkland Islands, and he claimed the Falkland Islands on behalf of the French. Now, he was concerned about the Arcadian people of New France. These were people that had settled in New France and lived in New France for a couple of generations, and they had been relatively neutral during the war, during the 7 Years' War. But the British actually had captured some of them fighting for the French. And the British really didn't want this group of people, these French heritage people, left in Canada, which might disrupt things and cause more rebellion. So they exiled them back to France. And they were looking for other places to be able to send these Arcadians. They went to Louisiana in the United States, and they also thought they'd be able to send them to the Falklands. And Bougainville himself actually paid for a lot of the relocations of these Arcadians to the Falklands. Now, the trouble with that is that the Spanish controlled all of South America, and they didn't like the idea of a French settlement just off the coast of where they might be a danger to Spanish settlements or Spanish treasure fleets. So they protested to the French. The French had just fought a war. They didn't want to be involved in another one, so they relented, and they ordered Bougainville to sell all his assets in the Falklands, and which he had to do. He was ordered in November 1766 by Louis XV to conduct the first French circumnavigation of the world, and he was given 2 ships, the Boudis, which had 214 men on board, and the Atoli, which had 116 men on board, but not quite, as we'll see in a second. One of the people on board was a man that was become famous in his own right, and I'll talk about Laperu, a great French explorer that explored even more of the Pacific than Cooke actually did. Just before we reach Sydney, I'll do a presentation about him. And they also had another man on board by the name of Philibert Commerson. Now, he became famous as well. He was a botanist, a very, very famous botanist in France, and he coined the idea of the noble savage, and he championed the idea that these Tahitians were the persona of the noble savage. He said, Who has not been, these were a people who had not been corrupted by civilization and therefore symbolises humanity's innate goodness because of the reception that they received when they came to Tahiti. Now, some of us are going on to Madagascar in a few weeks' time, and he was really enamoured with Madagascar as well. And he said, what an admirable country Madagascar is. It would merit not a casual observer, but entire academies. Madagascar, I may announce to naturalists, is their promised land. It is there that nature seems to have retreated as into a private sanctuary, to work on different models from any she has used elsewhere. The most curious, the most marvellous forms can be found at every step. So for those of us going on to Madagascar, I didn't know anything about it, but I read that and I thought, well, that sounds pretty good to me. The Commerce Dolphin, the distinctive black and white dolphin, is named in his honour, and he named the Bogan Wilier plant. He was the person who came up with that name in honour of his commander, Bougainville. He didn't actually complete the circumnavigation of the world himself. He died in Mauritius at the age of 45. He was sick when they got to Mauritius and he was offloaded there and he died. Now, he's also famous for the fact that he brought along his assistant on the Atoli, the ship the Atoli. The captain actually gave him the captain vacated his cabin and gave he and his assistant the use of the captain's cabin, which was very unusual at the time. And the reason was probably that his assistant was really his mistress. Her name was Jan Beret, and she went on board the Atoli disguised as a man. They were lovers. She had been his housekeeper when Commerson's wife died. She became his mistress, and then she became much more. She started doing on expeditions with him and became a very qualified botanist in her own right, and an artist, a very well-credentialed artist. So she was very handy to him, and he didn't want to lose her, so he smuggled her on board as a woman. And I'll talk about her at a later date as well. But she became the first lady to circumnavigate the world. Now, Bougainville arrived in Tahiti on April the 2nd, 1768, and he named her Nouvelle Science, sorry about my French, or the island of Aphrodite, the island of love. And once again, that was because of the welcome that the French sailors received when they got there by the local Tahitian ladies. They couldn't believe that sort of welcome. They also met a Tahitian prince by the name of Arturo, and they took him aboard the ship, and he completed the rest of the voyage back to Europe. So he was the first Tahitian to sail on a European ship and the first Tahitian to visit Europe. Now, he completed the circumnavigation in March 1769, and amazingly, he only lost 7 men out of the original 340 men during that voyage, which was an amazing figure at that time, amazing low figure at that time, because usually lots more crew would die during an epic voyage like that. He fought during the American Revolutionary War on behalf of the French, and he was the commander of the French fleet at the Battle of Chesapeake, which was the battle that led to the surrender of the British forces and the independence for America. He then went on to fight for the French in the Battle of the Saints against the British, which was when the French tried to take over the British colonies in the Caribbean. But this wasn't anywhere near as successful, and the French lost those battles. He rejoined the army. He went back to France and rejoined the army and was made Marshal de Camp, which was the third most senior person in the French army. And because of the way he was respected by the people, because of the way of his reputation, he was spared during the Reign of Terror, which saw 16,594 of his fellow aristocrats taken out and executed with the guillotine. But he was spared that, and he even became a French senator. His son, Hyacinth de Bougainville, had a very distinguished naval career himself. He went on to become a French admiral and a famous navigator and explorer around the Pacific in his own right. And he established what we now have in Sydney is the Laperu's monument. And as I said, I'll talk to you about Laperu's as we come towards Sydney. Now, the next person to arrive in Tahiti was, of course, James Cook, and we've heard about Cook over the last few days. He'd been commissioned by the Royal Society and the Admiralty to conduct a review of the transit of Venus across the Sun, which was going to take place on the 3rd of June 1769. So the Endeavour arrived in Tahiti on April 12, 1769, and established a base at Port Venus, which is the northernmost point of Tahiti, to do those observations. While he was there, Joseph Banks, who was the foremost botanist and scientist of his time, went ashore and was amazed by the fauna and flora that they found on the island. He also did a lot of work and documented a lot of information about the native society, the language of Tahiti, and also the customs. Cook learnt that the island had always been called Otahiti, and he didn't like the name King George III Island or King George Island, so he always referred to it as Otahiti. So you might think back, I mean, this is one of this is probably England's greatest maritime explorer, but he was never knighted. He never became Sir James Cook, did he? So maybe that had something to do with it. He circumnavigated the islands, and he met all the chiefs at the different places around the islands, and he met a high priest by the name of Tupia, who told them that he knew of 130 islands around the area within 2,000 nautical miles. And Cook didn't believe him. I mean, how could this be? I mean, how could this uneducated person, without a sextant, without charts, without navigational aids, without even watches and things to use with the sextant, how could he know about navigation and things, navigating by the stars? And Tupia eventually drew what's now known as the Tupia map, which is a famous map showing the islands around Tahiti. And Joseph Banks wanted Tupia to sail with the Endeavour, but Cook wouldn't allow it. So in the end, Banks had to pay for Tupia to have passage aboard the Endeavour. And once Cook started sailing towards these islands, he realised that, wow, this is true. I mean, this guy does know what he's talking about, and we are getting to the islands. And he became a very, very valuable resource to Cook as time went on. And Cook wrote in his journal while he was in Botany Bay in 1770, by means of Tupua, you would always get people to direct you from island to island, and would always be sure of meeting with a friendly reception and refreshments at every island you came to. So as I said, a very, very important resource for Cook. This is a painting of Tupia with a crayfish or a lobster, giving it to a British officer. The next person to arrive in Tahiti was a Spaniard by the name of Bonchia. Now, by this time, the reputation of Tahiti of being a sexual paradise for sailors had got around everywhere. And sailors were really looking forward to going there. But he brought in a policy of no sex for him and his men, which would have upset his crew to no end. And it also upset the locals. They didn't realise, they were used to this. They thought this was part of their normal culture. They would welcome people and treat them well via sex. That was just what they did. So they couldn't understand what they had done wrong. He went back to Spain, and at the Spanish not Spain, they went back to South America, and the Spanish there were also concerned that if the British established a base at Tahiti, that would be too close to South America as well, and they might also put their Spanish treasure fleets in danger, and so they wanted to establish a presence in Tahiti. So he went back to Tahiti in September 1744 and took with him some Catholic missionaries, and they established a mission at Tutia Bay, which is in the southern area of Tahiti. Bonucci died in Tahiti on January 26, 1775, and he was the first Catholic to be buried in Tahiti. The mission didn't do very well. The mission was down here, and it didn't do very well at all, and it was abandoned in 1775 because the three Catholic priests that were left there begged to be taken back home. They were overwhelmed. They said that was the pleasures of the the temptations of the flesh that they saw all around them were far too tempting. They had to get out of the place. So the mission was abandoned, and when Cooke came back at another time, he demolished the mission itself. Cooke returned on his second voyage of discovery between August and September 1773, and then he came back again on his third voyage of discovery in August 1777 with the Resolution and the Discovery. And it was at this time that he actually witnessed a human sacrifice. Sorry, that reminds me. I should have told you this before. I've got a note from Heather. Let everyone know we do have the opportunity tomorrow to witness a human sacrifice demonstration. But we need a volunteer. That volunteer will have a fairly central role in the presentation, in the demonstration. So if you would like to volunteer, all you really have to do is yawn at any time during this presentation and you'll be considered that volunteer, okay? The next person to arrive was Captain Bligh, and we all know the story of Bligh, and the mutiny on the Bounty. But Bligh had joined the Navy at the age of 16. He had sailed with Cooke on his third voyage of discovery into the Pacific aboard the Resolution, and he'd actually witnessed the massacre of Cooke in Hawaii. In October, he was sent, in 1788, he arrived in Tahiti to do the breadfruit, collect breadfruit to take to the Caribbean islands to feed the slaves there. But it wasn't really necessary for him to do that. There were other places much closer to the Caribbean or the Caribbean where breadfruit was available. The reason the British sent him all the way out to Tahiti was that they wanted to have a presence in Tahiti as well. Well, that was one of the reasons as well. And then, of course, the mutiny took place in April 28th, and where Bligh and 18 of his men were put into a 7-metre launch with a quadrant and a compass, but no charts, and they did that amazing voyage that we've heard about in an open boat of 3,618 nautical miles to get to Batavia, which was one of the great open boat voyages of all time. When he got back to England, Bligh was court-martialed, which was standard practice. If you lost your ship, you were automatically court-martialed. But he was found that he had no case to answer, and he went on to lead the second voyage, breadfruit voyage, where he did successfully go to Tahiti and then take those breadfruit around to the Caribbean. He became captain of HMS Director and was involved in the Nore Mutiny. So this was his second mutiny. And the Nore Mutiny was when the British fleet were at anchor in Plymouth, and a lot of the crews from a lot of the ships in the fleet actually mutinied because of the pay and the conditions that they were suffering from. They didn't have proper uniforms and warmth and everything, so they mutinied. The mutiny was put down fairly quickly, and the ringleaders executed or transported to the penal settlement in Australia, but that was the second mutiny that Bligh was involved in. He fought very well. In November 1797, he was, as captain of the Director, he participated in the Battle of Camperdown against the Dutch. He, on the Director, single-handedly engaged 3 Dutch vessels and captured all 3 of those Dutch vessels, including the flagship of the Dutch. And he captured their famous Vice Admiral Jan de Winter. And then he fought in the Battle of Copenhagen with Lord Nelson. And he performed so well during that battle that Lord Nelson himself commended him for his initiative and for his bravery. In March 1805, at the recommendation of Sir Joseph Banks, he was appointed Governor of New South Wales, so Governor of the Colony of Australia. That was the Colony of Australia at the time. But he had a lot of conflict when he got there. There was factions very influential factions of graziers and landowners who were in collaboration with the senior military officers of the New South Wales Army Corps. And they were taking advantage of a monopoly there and making a lot of money. And Bligh tried to break up that monopoly, and which brought on the Rum Rebellion on January 26, 1808. So that's his third mutiny, when the troops rebelled. And he was arrested by the New South Wales Corps. This is the oldest political cartoon in Australian history, and it shows him being dragged out from under his bed. Now, he denied for the rest of his life that he was hiding under his bed, but then it could have just been propaganda at the time. The rebellion itself was found to be illegal by the British Crown, and Bligh was promoted and returned to England. He ended up becoming an admiral in the British Navy, retired as an admiral. The mutineers from the Bounty, a lot of the mutineers, or some of the mutineers, had returned to Tahiti, and some of them had decided to stay there. And because of their expertise in weaponry and modern weaponry, they became very handy. And one of the local chiefs, the Chief Tua, decided to recruit them as mercenaries, and using their skills and their modern weapons to conquer other tribes within Tahiti. And that established the Pomera dynasty. And eventually, Chief Tua's descendants expanded their influence and they created a monarchy, and that went all throughout the French Polynesia. In the 1790s, the whalers and merchants and missionaries came to Tahiti, and this caused huge problems for the population. The whalers brought arms and alcohol and illness. Prostitution flourished, which made venereal disease very, very common. And the population went from 35,000 in the early 1790s down to 16,000 by 1797 because of the illnesses that the whalers had brought with them. So it was pretty good timing that English Protestant missionaries arrived in 1797. They tried to stop all this, the whalers taking advantage of the local population. They tried to speak to them about the morals that they needed to have, and they became fairly successful. They actually established a big Protestant following in Tahiti. And one of the people that they brought on as a Protestant was a local chief, Pomera II. He had fought a pitched battle in November 1815 against other tribes within the area, and he had been successful in that battle. And it was the first time that the whole of Tahiti was now united, and he was appointed the king, and it was under one monarchy. At the insistence of the Protestant missionaries, he brought in the first Tahitian legal code, which put a ban on nudity, a ban on immodest dances at all, and chants. They also brought in a dress code, which is a very Puritan dress code and probably not suitable for a tropical region. It was basically neck to ankle dress code. And he put a ban on human sacrifices, so we won't have that demonstration tomorrow after all. And then in the 1820s, most of the population converted to become Protestants. So this is the guy. This is the person considered by sailors of the Pacific to be the biggest traitor in the history of mankind. And it's because of him that, ladies, when you arrive in Tahiti tomorrow or tonight, instead of being met by these virile young warriors who would carry you away to a secluded waterfall and massage you with scented coconut oil all over your body, and gentlemen, instead of being met by beautiful young ladies whose only wish is to fill all of your worldly desires, we're actually going to be met by representatives of the Tahitian Ladies Temperance League. And they're going to give us some brochures about the evils of alcohol, and they're also going to give us a demonstration on how to crochet a decorative doily. So that's terrific, hey, yeah. I always say you just can't have enough decorative doilies. So, but it's because of this man that happened. So, as I said, to Pacific sailors, the greatest traitor in the history of mankind. And he's also the reason that a self-respecting sailor would ever have a mullet haircut. When we get there, you'll see that Paul Gauguin has a massive influence in Tahiti. He spent some time there between 1891 and 93 before returning to France. And then he came back again in 1895 until his death in 1903. And he lived in the French Polynesia during that time. And as we go through Tahiti, you'll see some of his works of art and his influence in the region. It's quite profound. And these are some of his paintings, which are considered some of his best work. So, in 1834, French Catholic missionaries began to arrive. And the British Protestants weren't all that happy about that, and they asked the Crown to remove them. So they were expelled in 1836, and that caused the French to send a gunboat to Tahiti to make sure that the Catholic missionaries were allowed back in. In 1840, the French declared Tahiti as a protectorate under their crown. But there was diplomatic frictions between the British and the French about who actually owned Tahiti. And so in 1847, the Jarnac Convention was signed. There was actually no physical confrontation, but there was lots of political and diplomatic tensions. The Jarnac Convention basically said that neither Britain nor France had any control over Tahiti, and it was an independent state. But the French reneged on the agreement, and in 1885 they came back and appointed a governor and established a general council on the island, which that gave them the proper administration to form a colony. And then in March 1898, Tahiti became part of what we now know as French Polynesia. And that's the history, the European history of Tahiti. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you've learnt something from it. I'll be doing another talk in about 3 days' time. And that's going to be a little bit of a fun talk. We're going to be talking about ghost ships and the phantoms of the sea, and having a bit of fun with it. And with all your help, we're going to work together, and we're going to solve one of the greatest maritime mysteries of all time. So I hope to see you there. Thank you.